Hello everybody, welcome back to another Questmarker review. Get ready, buckle up, and brew your coffee because we're off to the rainy town of Pineview in, have you heard about Rainswept? Rainswept is a 2D point-and-click adventure centered around a whodunit murder mystery. It largely seems to be a one-person creation by Frostword Interactive, and its minimalist style and janky animation speak to where the efforts of Rainswept reside. It's less in shiny graphics and more so in narrative and atmosphere. You'll notice the weird movement and the mouthless faces right away. It took me all of 2 minutes to get over the visual minimalism of Rainswept, but I will say that sometimes the animation looked a little dorky later in the game, as they cut some of the narrative tension with these pendulum arm stiff swinging and these weird butts. But you'll also notice the game's excellent direction right away. I greatly enjoyed how Rainswept was presented. There would have been ample opportunity in a point-and-click adventure to make me drag myself across the map to each location, but Rainswept often cuts right to the next scene with decisiveness and precision. There's not a lot of bloat in this adventure, and whenever there are moments where you're just trying to move across the map, I think it's done in a deliberate manner. It has its place in trying to break up the pacing and the movement of the game to perhaps allow for some introspection. I also think that these pauses and breaks and making you move across the Pineview landscape is meant to demonstrate the game's atmosphere, which is handled exceptionally well. Rainwater and coffee make for some simple, relatable, and effective mood-setting devices. Main Street and Center Street, and the church on the hill and the little coffee shop in the rain. I think we all get a really good sense of what Pineview as a town is, and especially considering we really only see half a dozen locations. Coupled with a solid soundtrack and minimal sound design, I think the overall presentation of Rainswept is effective. There's a couple tracks the game keeps coming back to that I think represent a good musical score, but sometimes I found the music a little too repetitive or a little too jarring. It could have done with a greater depth in the musical number, or perhaps there should have been more alignment in the game's overall tone. I should note that a lot of my problems with the game's music often are in the main detective's flashback sequences, but I also didn't enjoy those moments regardless of the music, so there's that. And speaking of detective, you of course are saddled up as Detective Michael Stone, a big city investigator who's come to the small town of Pineview after experiencing personal loss and trauma, and just has the burning desire to get a case solved right. He's partnered up with Officer Amy Blunt, who's the empathetic rock to stabilize Stone's more gruff, jaded, and sometimes erratic behavior. Yeah, if all of this is starting to sound like Broadchurch, you wouldn't be the first, and maybe because I just finished binging it on Netflix a few weeks back, but I kept finding similarities here and there, and that's not a bad thing. So while Detective Stone and Officer Blunt are the two main protagonists, we are then introduced to a small, lively cast of Pineview residents, from coffee shop owners to the town priest to the doctor, other policemen, the bartender, little Johnny, and so on. Detective Stone and Officer Blunt are tasked in investigating the deaths of both Diane Miller and Christopher Green, a young couple who only moved to Pineview a few months ago. Initial suspicion leads much of the town to think that the case was a murder-suicide, but Detective Stone has his hunch it could be something else. And that's the framing for the game. Honestly, I was captivated. I think Frostwood Interactive did a terrific job in the first half of this title to set the pacing, the writing, the tone, and Stone and Blunt as two capable leads. Partway through the first half, we experience stories and flashbacks of the two recently deceased, Diane and Chris, and they become the other pair of main characters the gamer spends a good chunk of time with. In the first half, Diane and Chris are a delight to watch. To see their budding relationship develop as just two young, insecure people in their mid-20s, it was relatable. I enjoyed the writing and the cinematography. It was great. But all of Rainswept's writing isn't terrific. Without getting into spoiler territory just yet, I think much of the blame can be at Detective Stone's arc. His flashbacks are bizarre, and I could tolerate the first cringy flashback with his dead wife, but oftentimes subsequent ones just became too much. There was too much, no! And there was way too many exclamation marks going on. It's weird and jarring. I get what the developers were going for, but minimalism usually is wonderfully paired with subtlety, like a good wine and a fine cheese. But the game is far too in your face about Michael's trauma. I don't know. I guess toss it up as subjective maybe, but I think these are certainly the weakest parts overall of the title. Especially as we now are going to get into spoiler territory for a second. I'm not going to be hugely spoilerific here and tell you who did it and so on and so forth, but still, skip ahead to the time on screen if you want a less story-informed review. Because something got messed up in Rainswept's second half. There's weird stuff going on that I just have to talk about. Part of it is Diane and Chris, and part of it is, again, Michael Stone. Diane and Chris's relationship throughout the game is meant to be shakily built on sand. Chris is drive and ambition, and Diane is cold and aloof and cynical, and all she wants to do is just get away from home. We find out Diane has been keeping her trauma of sexual assault secret from Chris, and we kind of get this as the reason why she gets so angry. There's a moment where she says she needs help. And I think that's great. The problem is that what directly preceded that conversation, that admission by Diane, was Chris assaulting her. I don't know. I don't know how to feel about it. And also the whole scene where Chris is quite literally some knight in shining armor to save his hot girlfriend who lives with her sexually abusive stepdad seemed way too wish fulfillment-y or way too unrealistic. Diane's whole person seems to be defined by surviving sexual assault. And I don't think in today's society we're looking for some kind of one-dimensional survivor. I think there could have been more to Diane's character than that. I don't know. Maybe you guys didn't think there was much of a problem there, or maybe you guys won't think there's much of a problem there. Let me know what you think, and let me know if you think that the writing falls apart in these moments. But the writing also unravels, in my opinion, around this time because Detective Stone is becoming less and less an effective detective. When he's given the directive to leave town by the head sheriff, he goes completely off the wall. When you learn about his mistake that ended up in Abigail's death, it just seems totally unfathomable, totally idiotic. I couldn't even relate. Who brings their wife to go meet a contact in a narco investigation? That seems so, okay, maybe, I don't know. Detective Stone just becomes less relatable, less likable, because unlike his arc, the similar erratic, jaded gruffness of Detective Hardy is way more relatable, because regardless, through it all, Detective Hardy remains a good detective. Stone's trauma seems to get in the way of him being an effective detective, and even though he solves the case at the end, I think it gets a little muddied in between the end of the first half and then the final chapter. I don't think the weakness of the second half significantly undermines the experience of Rainswept in its entirety. So, overall, I like Rainswept. I thought it was a good title. I think it's a good title. I was disheartened that it sort of lost its way by the final act of the game. But even during some of these weaker moments, there were bits and pieces that kind of still kept me playing and kept me intrigued and that I was still impressed with. There was the beautiful pans, the direction, the kind of cinematography that the developer used to illustrate the scene, the score, and there were still bits and pieces of clever writing amidst some of the weakest parts that still managed to find its way in and still managed to make Rainswept an enjoyable experience. I mean, I kept coming back for more. So yeah, this gets Questmarker's seal of approval. I largely enjoyed my experience over the 4 or so hours of playing this title. Rainswept receives a positive score. Go out and try it. I think it's a great indie title to check out. And now, if you excuse me, editing this review and all its coffee has made me want to go put a pot on. So I'll see you guys next time.